When Helen Morgan died, no one cried at the funeral. Not because they didn't love her, but because they were all too busy hiding who had already started counting the dollars. It sounded cynical even in my own thoughts, but I stood at the edge of the grave and saw it all too clearly. My sister Claire kept adjusting her hair as if she were heading to an audition, not a farewell. My brother Mark nervously fidgeted with an envelope in his jacket pocket, the very one that likely held the draft of the will he'd accidentally glimpsed in her desk drawer a week before she passed. And Aunt Jean, Dad's sister, whom Ellen tolerated only out of politeness, sat in her wheelchair, watching us all as if she already knew who would lose this quiet but brutal war. I'm Daniel, the middle child, the one who always stayed silent to keep the peace, the one they called the peacemaker, though in truth, I was just afraid of conflict. And now, standing under Michigan's gray sky, that fear had turned into nausea. Because Mom hadn't just left behind a house and savings. She'd left a secret. And it all began with a letter. The will was read 3 days after the funeral. Mr. Harper, the attorney from Grand Rapids, arrived with a thick folder and the face of a man who'd witnessed 1,000 families collapse over a single sheet of paper. Helen Morgan bequeaths all her assets, the lakeside house, savings account, investments, and personal belongings, in equal shares to her 3 children, Daniel, Claire, and Mark, he announced without looking up. Claire exhaled in relief. Mark frowned. He'd clearly expected more. But inside me something snapped, because this wasn't it. A week before her death, Mom had called me to her bedside. It was late, rain tapped against the windows, and she sat in her armchair by the fireplace, wrapped in the very same afghan she'd knitted back in 1987. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned. Daniel, she said, if anything happens to me, find the letter inside the old copy of Moby-Dick. It's not for everyone, only for you. And don't let them sell the house. Not until you know the truth. I didn't understand then. I thought it was the rambling of an aging mind. But now, listening to the attorney's dry recitation, I knew Mom had lied in her will, or someone had made her. After the reading, Claire immediately suggested selling the house. It's too big for the 3 of us, she said, adjusting her gold necklace. And the taxes, better to split the money and go our separate ways. Go our separate ways? Mark scoffed. You're joking, right? You didn't call Mom for 2 years until you heard she owned Ford stock. And you, Claire snapped back. You only showed up to borrow $5,000 and never paid it back. I stayed silent, but one thought circled in my head. Moby-Dick sits on the top shelf in the study. When everyone left, I stayed alone in the house. The air smelled of lavender and old wood, the scent of childhood. I went upstairs to Mom's study. The bookshelf was neatly arranged. Encyclopedias, photo albums, poetry collections. And there it was, the worn spine of Moby-Dick, the book Dad had given her on their wedding day. I pulled it out. On page 117, tucked between chapters about whaling ships and Captain Ahab's obsession, lay an envelope labeled, "For Daniel only. Do not open until you are all together." I froze. Until you are all together. She knew this would happen. She knew they'd fight, and she wanted us to read this together. But how could I get them back? Claire was already calling a realtor. Mark had driven off to Chicago, saying he wasn't sticking around in this museum. And Aunt Jean. She'd looked at me with an expression that suggested she knew more than she let on. I called Claire. Mom left something else, I said. Something personal. For all of us. What's the drama? She replied irritably. If it's not money, I'm not interested. Don't you want to know why she didn't mention you in her diary for the last 5 years? Silence. Then, I'll be there tomorrow. Mark took longer to convince. But when I hinted there might be another bank account, he agreed. The next evening, we gathered in the living room. Even Aunt Jean came, despite her back pain. Claire sat with her legs crossed. Mark tapped his fingers nervously on the armrest. I held the envelope in my hands. Mom asked us to read this together, I said. Just get on with it, Claire snapped. I have a buyer meeting tomorrow. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 pages filled with her neat handwriting. My dears, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And most likely you've already started fighting. Forgive me, I never wanted that. But I had no other choice. All my life I tried to be fair. But fairness isn't always equality. Sometimes, fairness is truth. You think this house is just bricks and wood. But to me, it's where I sheltered you from storms. Where you first said, Mama. Where your father died in my arms. It's not property. It's memory. And here's what I must tell you now. Not as your mother, but as a woman who stayed silent too long. Claire, you are not my biological daughter. You're my sister Linda's child. She died in childbirth. I took you in because I couldn't bear to see you sent to an orphanage. I loved you as my own. But you always felt different. That's why you sought your worth in money. Mark, you're not my son by blood. You were adopted. Your parents died in a crash when you were 3. I chose you from dozens of children because you looked at me like you already knew I'd be your mom. But you've always feared I'd send you back. That's why you cling to things, as proof you belong here. And Daniel, you're my true son. Not because I gave birth to you, but because you're the only one who ever saw me, not as an heir, but as a person. I leave the house to all 3 of you, not because you deserve it, but because only together can you understand. Family isn't something you divide. It's something you hold together. Sell the house, and you'll lose each other forever. Stay, and you might find what I've tried to give you all your lives. Forgiveness. With love, Ellen. Silence stretched for a minute, maybe 2. Then Claire stood, walked to the window and cried, quietly, without drama. Mark bowed his head. I looked at them and, for the first time in years, didn't feel like a mediator. I felt like a son. Aunt Jean broke the silence. Linda was my best friend. I knew the truth. But Ellen made me promise to stay quiet. She wanted you to love each other as you are, not out of duty, but from the heart. Why didn't she tell us sooner? Claire whispered. Because she was afraid you'd think love could be measured in blood. I replied. We didn't sell the house. Mark moved back from Chicago and opened a furniture restoration workshop in the garage. Claire quit her real estate career and now runs family therapy workshops, helping others avoid our mistakes. And I simply stayed. I tend the garden, read by the fireplace, and sometimes catch myself talking to Mom out loud. Because now I know the real inheritance isn't money. It's the time you shared and the chance to begin again. And Ellen's letter remains in that same copy of Moby-Dick. Just in case any of us forget what it truly means to be family.